The applause swelled as James Corden stepped out from behind the curtain, the band hitting a bright, familiar groove that instantly set a celebratory tone. He waved with an easy confidence, flashing the wide grin audiences had known for years, and walked straight toward Jimmy Fallon with open arms. The two embraced in a way that felt practiced but genuine, the kind of hug that signaled shared history rather than mere television politeness. Jimmy joked about it being a late-night multiverse crossover, and James fired back that he was just there to steal the snacks. The audience laughed loudly, relieved and entertained, the energy light and playful. James took his seat, adjusting his jacket, glancing around the studio as if taking it all in. Jimmy leaned against his desk, relaxed, visibly enjoying the moment. They reminisced about award shows, backstage chaos, and the strange fraternity of late-night hosts who all pretended to compete while quietly understanding one another's exhaustion. James talked about life after stepping away from nightly television, describing mornings without alarms and dinners without writer's notes. Jimmy exaggerated his jealousy, feigning despair at the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. The band punctuated the jokes perfectly, and the audience stayed with them every step of the way. The conversation flowed effortlessly into reflections on pressure, on the strange intimacy of speaking to millions every night while feeling oddly alone. James spoke thoughtfully, his tone sincere, acknowledging that hosting a show meant absorbing endless opinions, both fair and unfair. Jimmy nodded sympathetically, sharing a few self-deprecating stories about jokes that hadn't landed and interviews that went sideways. It felt like a mutual confessional, two performers gently lowering their guards. Then Jimmy tilted his head and smiled, the way hosts do when pivoting into riskier territory. He mentioned how, toward the end of James's run, public criticism had seemed louder than ever. He framed it as curiosity, as something viewers had wondered about. James's smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. He took a small breath before answering, saying criticism came with the job and that he'd had to confront parts of himself he wasn't proud of. The audience quieted slightly, sensing the tonal shift. Jimmy followed with a light laugh, saying the internet could be brutal, and tossed in a quick remark about how memes had a way of sticking. James nodded, agreeing, but added that memes often stripped away nuance, turning complex moments into permanent labels. His voice stayed calm, careful, as if he were choosing each word with intention. A few audience members murmured in agreement. Jimmy, trying to keep things buoyant, joked about late-night hosts being professional punching bags. Then, almost offhandedly, he referenced the restaurant stories that had circulated online, letting the implication sit in the air. A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, thinner than before. James's posture shifted, he leaned back slightly, then forward again, clasping his hands. He responded evenly, saying public narratives had a way of freezing people at their worst moments, ignoring growth that happened quietly, away from headlines. He said apologies weren't performances, and change wasn't always visible. The studio felt still now, the humor giving way to something more reflective. Jimmy nodded, but before James could continue, he jumped in with another joke, attempting to soften the mood, suggesting everyone had a villain era online. The band hesitated, missing their cue, and the silence stretched just a beat too long. James looked at Jimmy, really looked at him, his expression open but firm. He said that when jokes echoed the harshest criticisms people faced, they didn't always feel playful, especially when they came from peers. His voice never rose, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. The audience responded with scattered applause, unsure but supportive. Jimmy shifted his stance, sensing the tension, and tried to reframe again. He said it was all part of the gig, that late night thrived on poking fun, even at uncomfortable truths. He smiled, hoping to pull things back into familiar territory. But the rhythm was broken. James straightened fully now, shoulders squared. He said that accountability mattered to him, deeply, but so did fairness. He explained that carrying years of public judgment had been heavy, that jokes could reopen things people were trying hard to move beyond. The words came steadily, not accusatory, but honest. The audience fell quiet, listening intently. A few heads nodded. Jimmy attempted another interjection, a gentle laugh, saying he hadn't meant anything by it. But the interruption itself seemed to underline James's point. James paused, then spoke again, slower this time. He said intent didn't always match impact, and that sometimes even friendly spaces could unintentionally cross lines. The studio lights felt brighter, the air tighter. The band remained silent. Camera operators subtly adjusted, sensing something unscripted unfolding. Jimmy's smile faltered as he leaned on the desk, hands clasped, trying to respond without escalating. He said he respected James and admired how open he was being. But before he could continue, James gently raised a hand, not in anger, but as a signal. He said he appreciated the invitation and the platform. He thanked Jimmy for the years of mutual respect. Then he said, quietly but clearly, that he wasn't comfortable turning genuine struggles into entertainment, even unintentionally. He rose from his chair, the movement deliberate and unhurried. A collective gasp moved through the audience. Jimmy stood as well, surprised, palms out in a placating gesture, saying there was no disrespect intended. James nodded, acknowledging that, but added that he needed to honor his own boundaries. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the studio with conflicted energy. Backstage, the air felt cooler, quieter, stripped of the laughter that had filled the studio moments earlier. James Corden moved down the narrow hallway with measured steps, his shoes echoing softly against the polished floor. A producer hurried alongside him, speaking in a low, careful voice, asking if he wanted to take a moment, if he wanted water, if he wanted to talk. James nodded politely but didn't slow down. His expression wasn't angry, it was focused, as though he were holding himself together by choosing calm over reaction. Behind the curtain, monitors still showed the stage. Jimmy Fallon stood under the lights alone now, hands resting on the edge of his desk, eyes flicking briefly toward the camera and then away. The band waited, instruments lowered, unsure whether to fill the space or stay silent. Jimmy took a breath and addressed the audience, acknowledging that live television sometimes went in unexpected directions. He said he respected James deeply and hoped viewers understood that no harm had been intended. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness there, an awareness that the moment had slipped beyond his control. The audience applauded, but it was restrained, more supportive than celebratory. The show moved forward, commercial break, a segment reset, but the energy never quite returned to its earlier warmth. Laughter came slower, applause shorter, as if everyone was processing what they'd just witnessed. In the hallway, James finally stopped. He leaned one hand against the wall and closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. A member of his team joined him, concern etched across their face. James opened his eyes and gave a small, reassuring smile, saying he was fine. He explained that he hadn't planned to leave, that it hadn't been a dramatic gesture. He just knew, in that moment, that staying would mean betraying something he'd worked hard to rebuild, his sense of self outside the noise. Word traveled quickly through the studio. Crew members whispered, glancing between monitors in the hallway. Phones buzzed. Social media clips were already circulating, captions framing the moment in sharp, sensational language. Some called it a meltdown. Others called it brave. The truth, as usual, lived somewhere quieter in between. James was escorted to a private dressing room, where he sat on the edge of a couch, loosening his tie. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a heavy stillness. He replayed the exchange in his mind, not with regret, but with clarity. He thought about how easy it was for humor to become armor, and how often people mistook composure for comfort. He knew the headlines would exaggerate, that intent and context would be lost. But he also knew he'd said what he needed to say. On stage, Jimmy pushed through the rest of the show with professionalism, but his usual buoyancy was tempered. During the closing minutes, he looked straight into the camera and reiterated that conversations mattered, even uncomfortable ones. He avoided jokes, choosing sincerity instead. When the credits rolled, he exhaled deeply, shoulders dropping as the lights dimmed. Afterward, Jimmy stepped backstage, seeking James instinctively, only to be told he'd already left. The realization settled heavily. Jimmy sat on a nearby stool, rubbing his hands together, replaying the moment from his own perspective, the joke that landed wrong, the interruption he hadn't meant to push too far. He knew he hadn't intended harm, but he also knew intent didn't erase outcome. The boundary James had drawn was clearer now, and that clarity stung. Outside, James emerged into the night, the city buzzing around him, unaware of the quiet storm that had just unfolded inside a television studio. He paused before getting into his car, taking in the hum of traffic, the anonymity of darkness. For the first time that evening, he felt lighter. Not triumphant, just settled. By morning, the story had exploded. Clips were dissected, slowed down, captioned, debated. Some praised James for standing up for himself, for refusing to let humor trivialize growth and accountability. Others accused him of overreacting, of misunderstanding the tone of late-night television. Jimmy released a brief statement expressing respect for James and regret that the conversation had caused discomfort. James didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, it was with a simple message posted hours later. He wrote about boundaries, about learning when to stay and when to step away. He didn't name names. He didn't assign blame. He just explained that growth sometimes meant choosing discomfort in the short term to preserve honesty in the long run. The moment faded from trending lists within days, replaced by new controversies, new clips. But for those who'd watched live, it lingered. Not as a scandal, but as a reminder that even polished formats could crack when real feelings surfaced. That laughter, once interrupted, couldn't always be cued back on command.